I'm going to start my talk in a weird place. This is Worms World Party. And in 2001, I played a lot of this video game. That was 18 years ago. And 18 years ago, I worked in a lab. This is a website that I actually made. I had to dig it up on the Wayback Machine. But this is the website for the West Virginia Virtual Environments Laboratory. I got a really cool job as an undergrad. One of my professors suggested me to this computer science professor who'd started this lab. And so I was in this virtual reality laboratory along with a bunch of computer scientists, and I was just sort of like, what am I doing here? And working with those folks. And here's a little description. Virtual reality is a relatively new, cool field in computer science. And it was cool, and we did take advantage over the fact that we had PCs with really great graphics cards, and we played a lot of video games when we weren't doing our actual work. And so that was 18 years ago, and I would say in the last 5 years, I've been a huge skeptic of the sort of hype bubble that's been around immersive technology and virtual reality and those sets of technologies. And I think for me personally, I've been waiting for this for almost 20 years to be a reality and be available to the public. And it just didn't seem like it was there yet. And it's just been sort of in the last year that I've really felt that we're to a place where the public is going to get to experience these things in interesting ways. Fast forward 18 years later, I now work at the Knight Foundation as our Director of Arts and Technology. Knight Foundation is a weird foundation. Private philanthropies are strange beasts. The Knight Foundation itself was started by the brothers who owned Knight Ridder Publishing, which was the largest newspaper chain in the US at one point, since been sold. And we have three focus areas: journalism, communities, and arts. And for our communities and our arts programs, we're largely focused on 8 cities around the country, and those were cities where there were Knight newspapers. And we do a lot of work in our arts program, working with large institutions in those cities, and also through things like the Knight Arts Challenge, which just yesterday we wrapped up the submission period for our Miami contest, where we're looking for more grassroots, authentic work that's happening in those communities. I was brought into Knight Foundation very early on to work with our journalism and media program and around civic technology to help those grantees think about how they use human-centered design, how they build early-stage technology, and how they sort of think about users and the folks that they're serving with this technology. And that's grown into a larger portfolio of work that's now happening within the arts space. And when I moved over to the arts program, it meant that I got to do really cool stuff, and I got to work with really cool organizations like Gray Area, like New Inc. in New York City, which is a fantastic incubator as part of the New Museum, with the School for Poetic Computation, who's working on a workshop that'll be happening in Detroit soon, Processing Foundation, like Jack's mentioned, and the Clinic for Open Source Arts, which is at the University of Denver. These are just some of the sort of grants that we've done in this space. And like has been mentioned several times, we also funded the Experiential Space Research Lab here at Gray Area, which was an interesting one. Josette mentioned the telephone conversation that we had. And that telephone conversation happened after I just got out of a sort of roundtable discussion with museum professionals. And one of the things that I heard was a real disdain for pop-up experiences. Museum of Ice Cream came up, and it was the classic, like, that's not a real museum. That's not a serious thing. And then the really, and I would say brilliant criticism of Amanda Hess later came out in the New York Times of these sorts of experiences. And in the back of my mind, I thought, well, I think there's probably more happening here, right? We need to understand what is bringing people to these spaces, and what we can learn about those models. And so when Josette and Barry sort of talked about, yeah, we're interested in these experiences because as digital artists, we know that the sort of object-based art gallery model doesn't work for our folks. And we're seeing this trend happening where you have these spaces and people are buying ticketed experiences that are maybe temporary or maybe they're built to last longer. But we think it's a model that's maybe more aligned with the performing arts, but maybe will work in visual art and digital art. And that's felt really exciting to me. And so they've been on this crusade for the last year, trying to understand what that model is and what the potential looks like for digital artists. As fun as that is, the bulk of my work is working with institutions like this. This is the Perez Art Museum in Miami. Has anybody been to PAM? It is an amazing museum. If you get to Miami, make sure that you go to this museum. One, because it's just beautiful. The architecture is fantastic, and you can just sit on the patio and look at the bay and never look at the art and still enjoy yourself. But they're also exhibiting fantastic contemporary art. I'm working with museums in the technology space to think about how do they engage audiences in new ways. Our interest is, in our thought process with our technology program, is that these large institutions need to become savvy in technology, and they need to be able to meet people where they're at. So much of our lives are lived online and in digital spaces these days that in order to stay relevant, these institutions need to build skills in the digital area. And not just in the digital space, but also a broader understanding of the people that they serve and their audiences, how to communicate with them in new ways, and how to build experiences that are relevant to their lives. About a year ago, we ran another call for ideas, which was a set of prototype projects. And one of the things that happened when we ran that, I did a little bit of analysis on what was showing up in our applications. And one of the largest trends, about a quarter of the applications, we received 900 applications for this call for ideas, and about a quarter of them dealt with virtual reality, augmented reality, or some type of immersive technology. And so when we thought about what do we need to do next, how can we keep these organizations working with technology in interesting ways, one of the things that we thought about is, well, can we go to where the interest already is and where there's already energy within the field? And are we ready in the space of immersive technology to be thinking about how it's deployed in large arts institutions? So I asked my board of directors if we could do that. And here's my little drum roll. Today we're opening up a call for ideas. And so it's a $750,000 total grant pool for ideas around how arts organizations might use immersive tech. So we're thinking about arts institutions, we're thinking about the active presentation and engagement through these technologies. This is a little bit different, right? So we're not asking for content as much. We're not thinking about what's the new VR film that you're creating. Instead, we're thinking about how do we present these experiences in cultural spaces. And so one answer to that might be how a space like this is used and new opportunities to use immersive technology in these spaces. Others might be how museums or symphonies or others can potentially take advantage of these technologies. We're working with Microsoft as a partner on this. Microsoft is offering access to their XR team as part of the experience. So we'll be taking folks to Redmond to sort of learn what they're thinking about and have access to technology and those sorts of things. Despite the fact that Microsoft is involved, we're also technology agnostic. We're not suggesting that anyone needs to specifically utilize Microsoft technology. But one of the advantages of being a funder like us is that we can provide access to partners like Microsoft. This is happening starting today. We've got a deadline coming up of August 12th. And we're thinking about a few different things as part of this. One, of course, engaging new audiences. And I would stress the new part there, right? I think that one of the big opportunities here is that arts institutions can think about how these technologies and experiences can bring folks into their spaces that might not otherwise come into their spaces, or connect with their mission in some way that they might not otherwise. We're also thinking about what is the service model that wraps around these experiences, right? So maybe there we're thinking about not just what happens in the headset, but what does an arts organization have to figure out, everything that comes before we put the headset on and everything that comes after we take the headset off. What is that entire service and experience? What does it look like? And how do we start to operationalize those sorts of things within arts institutions where these might be new things? We're thinking about opportunities to get beyond walls. Arts institutions tend to be, to think really within their walls and their spaces, and I think this is an opportunity to get beyond them. And we're thinking about things like distribution. How do these experiences travel? How do they get distributed to multiple institutions, whether that be a sort of cinema-like model or something else? And so to just sort of focus on that, it's a little bit more about the approach than content. And so I'll give one example of a Knight Foundation grantee and how I think their project sort of talks to some of the things that we're touching on here. This is the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. It's in downtown Philadelphia. It has a long and somewhat complicated history, and if you don't know that history, it's worth some research. But they did a project that was a VR project about a year ago, and I really love it because it's the dumbest, stupidest use of this technology that you could think of. They're an organization that has a fantastic sense for audience research, and really sort of documents their process that goes into each project. So I'd encourage you, there are several Medium articles by Shelley Bernstein on this specific project that I'm mentioning. But it starts from a place that a lot of museums struggle. And what they heard through a lot of their research was museums, I just can't picture myself in a museum, right? I don't picture myself there. And so that's what sort of launched them into a virtual reality project. And the project itself is really simple. They did simple 360 photography of their spaces. They put that into a lightweight VR experience. And then if you know anything about where the Barnes is at, they're right on the sort of cultural strip in Philadelphia, and they're across the street from the library. And what they did is just literally walk across the street to the library. And the cool thing about this technology at the moment is it's still new and novel, and everyone wants to try it out. And so if you set up in the library with 10 headsets on a table and say, hey, do you want to check out this VR experience? Chances are folks will say yes, and this is the case here. And so what's happening is folks are sort of looking around the gallery. And at the same time, they have educators who are talking to them about what they're seeing, what the space is, what the artwork is. And the feedback that they're hearing are things like, I didn't even know what that building across the street was. I'd been wondering what was over there. And so they go through this experience, and so folks get this sense of, oh, well, I can picture myself in that space now, right? I understand what that space is. and what it sort of feels like to be there. The next piece I think is really critical, because after that, they say to folks, hey, do you want to hop on public transit? Well, I'll hop on the bus. Let's go to the museum. And so they take folks to the museum for free that went through this experience. And they give them an experience of the space in real life. And then they give them some passes to come back. And they say, bring your family back. We'd love to have you here. And they're finding like a 30% return rate, which for a museum is really, really fantastic. And so when I think about that, what I like about it, for me, it really sort of matches up with this sort of 5E model of experience, right? So this notion of we have an overarching concept, right? And here the concept is we want to try to help people picture themselves in our space. You do something that creates some excitement, and in this case, it's showing up at the library with a bunch of VR headsets. We invite entry into the space, and so there's an experience of sort of crossing over from your everyday context into a new context. And then you have activities that engage people while they're in that space. And here, the educators really are part of that. And then there's an exit, right? The experience is over, but an extension, right? There's sort of an invitation back. And I think this project in particular does a really fantastic job of showing what that can look like, even if it's kind of the dumbest use of VR, right? Like we have real folks in the room that are doing really super sophisticated stuff. But here we have an arts organization that understands what their goal is, understands that the technology can help them achieve that goal. And this is the kind of thinking that we're often looking for from our grantees. As part of the work that we're doing around this call for ideas, we've also partnered with IMMERSE. So IMMERSE is a publication, immerse.news. They've started to put out a new issue of their publication focused on arts institutions and sort of critically thinking about the question that we're asking. And one of the things that we really love is sort of setting up the ability for others to think about this, right? The reason that we do sort of an open call for ideas is not that we know the answer to the question that we're asking. If we knew the answer, we would just go fund that thing. Instead, we ask this big sort of broad question to get ideas in front of us that we never would have thought existed. So one of the things that, we just sort of came out of office hours and stuff, the question often that we get is, what kind of ideas are you looking for? And the answer is we don't know, and we hope they don't look exactly like the things that we funded in the past. But we do know is we learn each time we do these kinds of open calls for ideas. The last time we did an open call for idea, we learned that there's an incredible energy around immersive technology, and then we started researching that and figuring out what's happening in that space before we shape something around presentation in these spaces. And I want to say one more thing about IMMERSE. I do hope you'll read the new issue, but I think even more important is they've also published a fantastic report by Kamal St. Clair called Making a New Reality. And I think her work and the work of folks like her is really important because they're thinking about how this new form of storytelling can allow us to tell stories that aren't being told, and how we can take shape of those stories and take control of that new media early on before everyone rushes in. So I'm Chris, be happy to talk to anyone at any time. My colleague Janie is here as well. You can shoot me an email. I'm pretty easy to find. And apply to the challenge. This is unlike the PDF example. It's 6 questions. We don't ask you for a budget at first. We know that a lot of people will apply. We want to make it as easy and effective on your time as we can. So please do. Thank you.